Hi, I'm Ginger Campbell, the host of Grain Rainbows. This is a corrected version of my recent interview with Quinn Crum. I want to offer my deepest apologies for misgendering Quinn in the original introduction to this interview. If you've already listened to this episode, please note that only the introduction and closing have changed.
I think I was reading up on asexuality. That was a new concept to me also at the time. And that's, I think, where I encountered the term non-binary for the first time also. And read about that and said, wow, this looks like what I've been looking for my whole life. Now, that makes my story really different because now I'm about almost 50 years old. And I had not identified as queer before. I still feel that makes it more difficult for me to see myself as part of the community.
Welcome to Grain Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are on your journey, I hope this podcast will help you feel less alone. Today's guest is listener Quinn Crum, who graciously volunteered to share their story. As a person who came of age in the early 1970s, I've had a little trouble understanding what it means to consider oneself non-binary, so I really appreciate Quinn's willingness to share their journey of self-discovery. I'll be back after the interview to share a few final thoughts. Before we jump into the interview, I do want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Grain Rainbows at grainrainbows.com, and you can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app, even if Apple Podcasts has changed it to follow. You can also get show notes automatically via our newsletter. Just use the link in the show notes that appear in your podcasting app or text Grain Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. Spell grain with an A. Grain Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. I'd love to hear from you. You can send me email at grainrainbows@gmail.com. You can also post to the Grain Rainbows fan page on Facebook. On Twitter, I'm at GrainR. We also have a private group on MeWe, which I'll tell you more about after the interview. So, Quinn Crum, welcome to Grain Rainbows.
Yeah, good to be here.
Now, you are going to be, I think, my first non-binary guest. So, I would like, if you don't mind, would you explain, what that term means to you?
Yeah, generally non-binary refers to binary gender. Binary gender meaning there are men and women. And non-binary means that I don't identify with either of those words.
Fair enough. I just figured that it's good to start with clear definition of terms, especially since some older listeners may be confused by the expression. So I usually just let people start and tell their story in whatever they want, in whatever way they want. Does that work for you?
It does. I have prepared for that. Well, I would like to start giving a background where I grew up and when first. It was the 1970s. I think most of my formative years, the 1970s, which is sometimes called the least gendered decade. And I specifically remember a study of this toys section in the Sears catalog over the time, over 100 years. And it found that the 1970s had the least gendered presentation of toys. So most pictures had both boys and girls inside, things like that. So it is a thing. I will come to that maybe a little more. And also the place is Germany. And maybe what's important about that is that Germans are generally a little, compared to Americans, certainly less panicked about talking about sex and talking to children about sex, I think. Although it was still the 1970s, so it was not as open as it is now. But yeah, generally Germans are rather matter of fact about these things. It's natural bodily function. Sometimes it's a bit too matter of fact for my taste, even. Yeah, I would like to talk about my family situation. So my mother, yeah, as I said, it was the 1970s. It was second wave feminism, and the idea that we should not treat gender as important and bring up our children the same, whether they're boys or girls. It was in the air, and I think my mother picked up on that also. But also on a personal level, she just treated every child as an individual. There were three of us in the house, so two boys and one girl by the standards of society. But we were very different, each of us, and my mother was reacting to each of us very different. For example, I was the one that most likely to get scared and cry and hold on to her, and that was okay, and it was not read in a specifically gendered way by her. My father was not too big a presence in my life. He was often busy with work when I was little, and then my parents got divorced when I was 8. So, and I lived with my mother. So there's maybe not as much influence from there, or I didn't have to deal with that too much in my identity questions. I do include non-binary into trans. Not all people do that, but I do. And what that means is that, yeah, I was treated as being a boy, but I don't see myself as that, and therefore I'm trans. So I may use the word sometimes just so there's no confusion. So, as most trans people, I dug in my early memories for signs that I was trans or somehow different regarding gender in my early years. When did this start? And I didn't come up with too much. I would say I didn't have too many, specifically feminine interests. I was not interested in wearing dresses or playing with dolls or something, not particularly. Although I didn't mind playing with dolls, I was sometimes playing with my sister, her friends, or with cousins, and I didn't mind. It was not super interesting, but I also didn't have a lot of the very specific masculine interests. I didn't like sports. I didn't like to play outside much. So I was in the middle space there anyway. Yeah, I liked reading books and doing music and on the piano. Maybe the only gender non-conforming thing is that I always liked long hair. Never liked my haircut. But that's not too specific either. Yeah, so, well, I did feel different and not really fitting in my whole life, but I usually had other ways of explaining that. So, one thing that I was always very much ahead in my intellectual development. Yeah, I skipped 2 years in school, and it made me an outsider anyway, as it very different from the people around me. And everyone was telling me that all the time also. Oh, this one is intelligent, and this one will be go to university and whatever. My mother says that at 4 years old, when I was asked, what do you want to be when you're an adult, I said professor, even though I couldn't know what that means at 4 years old, but somehow I knew I guess, it's like a teacher, but even better. And also, yeah, I had these interests like books and music. So I was a nerdy science, a lot of science. So I was a nerdy and an artistic person. So that would explain how I'm different from a lot of my peers. So I didn't need to go to gender to explain that. But I did find maybe two things that are remarkable, that I find remarkable in my memories after a lot of digging. One thing is that I always found it strange when people made statements about boys are like that, girls are like that, because I just couldn't confirm that with the people around me, with my siblings, and with the friends I was playing with. We were always playing in mixed groups in the neighborhood, actually. There was not a lot of separation of by gender. And I didn't find that when people would say, oh, boys like climbing on trees. Well, my experience, girls like climbing on trees too. And in general, really, even statistically, I didn't see a difference there. So that didn't convince me much. And actually, I like to say, there's this expression, I'm born this way. I sometimes like to say, yeah, I'm born this way, skeptical. I think a lot of the things that adults told me when I was a child, I was skeptical about very early on. I was not believing things easily. Then I remember one specific episode. One thing I noticed when I was a child already is like maybe around 6 years old or so, that a lot of the girls around me occasionally said, oh, I wish I was a boy. It was a quite normal thing to say. And I understand there's a lot of reasons for that. Boys had fewer restrictions. They were less harshly treated if they stayed outside too long or get dirty, or they had less obligations in the household often, things like that. So I sometimes thought, well, I wish I was a girl. But I knew not to say that. I knew even at 6 years old, I knew that it's not good to say that. And there was one time that I remember that I thought, why am I even thinking that? And I realized that, yeah, one reason at least that I'm thinking that is that if I was a girl, the fact that I'm sometimes shy or scared or cry would not be such a big deal. So there's one thing maybe that where I saw that, well, there's a set of expectations around gender, and I'm not conforming to those expectations, and that's sometimes a problem. Yes, but that already tells me that this is not about my inner sense of gender that people sometimes talk about. When you ask a trans person, how do you know you're a woman, or how do you know you're a man? I just feel it inside. Well, I don't feel it inside. I have come to this realization now. I don't feel anything like that inside, and probably didn't, at least not strongly, even when I was a child. I already saw that as just something that society puts on me. So and I thought probably as a child, mostly I thought that I can ignore that. Boys and girls, yeah, they're treated differently sometimes, but it's not such a big deal. It was not such a big deal in my families. But when puberty hit, it wasn't so easy anymore. And a lot of differences popped up. And yeah, I was definitely uncomfortable with the messages I received about how the interactions between boys and girls are to be now that you're older, and when it comes to romance and sex, the gender roles in there, somebody was deeply uncomfortable with those things. So at that time, I started actually seriously thinking whether maybe I'm a trans woman, and that's another interesting thing to note.
How old were you?
I think maybe 13 or so that I had these thoughts. Yes.
So would you have used at that, because transgender wasn't a term at that point, so
Yeah.
would you have used transsexual as your word? Or I'm just trying to think back about what
Yeah.
words we were using back then.
Yes, it's actually an interesting fact. I think that I knew about that phenomenon.
Yeah, very unusual.
Remember pretty distinctly at about 9 years old that I had a conversation with a friend about that. I heard that apparently it was interesting to me. I heard that there are, and that was the words I used at the time, there are men who get an operation and then they are women. That was my understanding at the time, naive understanding. I must have picked it up somewhere on TV or in a magazine, more likely. And I found that interesting, apparently, because it stayed with me and I kept that. So, yeah, I don't think I had a specific term, but the term would have been transsexual probably at the time, yes. Actually, in 1978, there was a big case in the highest court in Germany, 1978, that allowed transsexuals to have their gender changed officially. So in the legal records, that was, and that's maybe the first time that really there would have been a little more explicit discussion and with the term transsexual in the society, I guess.
So you're 13 and what's going on?
I was starting to think that maybe that's what what happens to me, but yeah, it's never become too serious. So this question came up again and again throughout my life. I went to therapy several times, and we will come to that. And each time I brought it up, but usually it didn't become the centerpiece of the conversation. So we will see how that develops in my story. So I wanted to talk a little about school, of course, because I was non-conforming, as we would say nowadays. It was unusual for a boy. So, of course, I was also confronted with the question, are you gay? But I must say it was really not very harsh. The environment I was in was relatively tolerant, I think. I usually just answered no without getting too riled up, and then it wasn't interesting enough, and it didn't come back to me. And I never had an actual problem with that. I was never bullied specifically for that, although I was bullied, but I think it was more about my general, because I was sensitive and small and things like that. So not a lot of challenge there either. So from that side. But yeah, it was an ongoing thing that I felt that I want to be a good person. That was important to me. But there are certain expectations of being male that I felt were incompatible with that and put me in a bind. And as a result, I think I chose being a good human anytime, but it gave me the impression, it gave me the feeling that I will never be attractive to women. I will never have a woman partner because I was attracted to women. So that made me feel a bit lonely in that department. So I remember that about the age of 18 or 19, I had this conversation with myself. Maybe I have to get used to the fact that I will never have a partner. I will never marry or have a family. But I get prepared for that. But yeah, around the age of 20, I went to therapy the first time. And then almost every 10 years, but we'll see how that goes. So at 20, it was student counseling, maybe not really therapy. At 30, I went to group therapy. And yeah, as I said, I always brought up gender, but it was never the main thing. There was so many other things that I wanted to talk about too. I think I was depressed also. I could not study. I was 20, I was in a crisis and I could not focus on my studies. And those things at 30 in a group therapy, I just thought a lot about my romantic difficulties of having romantic relations or even friends, finding friends, how difficult that is for me. And gender didn't become a big subject. But then at some point, I decided I needed to make it a big subject. And I actually went to a therapist who was specializing in questions of gender. And that was in believe in 1997, would make me 32 years old. And it was good that there was such a therapist around at that time. I think it's because it was a small town where I lived, but a university town. That's why there's a much more breadth of such offerings. And I went to a support group connected to that therapist. And that's where I actually met trans people for the first time, a bunch of trans people, also some trans men for the first time. That never occurred to me that there would be also people who feel as men and are assigned female at birth. And I didn't have a chance to have many sessions with that therapist because I was already had plans to go to Japan for a while for studies. And so I knew that, but I went to the support group anyway, and to see those people, that was interesting. And it never scared me. I mean, we also went to drink afterwards sometimes. And yeah, I remember standing on the street with this group of trans people and some flashy trans women. And I thought, oh, yeah, a lot of people would be hesitant to be seen in this group, but I actually feel good. I like those people. And I feel light in this environment. You know, I feel there's a pressure not there that is usually around me all the time. It was good. However, I still felt I am not like them in general. And I also brought that up to the therapist in one of the, I think just 2 sessions I had with the therapist. 2 things that bothered me. One, they try to really over fulfill the role of man and woman. And I felt that is not for me. I'm not particularly interested in having makeup and elaborate dress and so on. I'm nerdy. I will still be nerdy even if I was a woman and wear glasses and jeans, I guess. And the other thing is they all seem to think that if I just transition, that will solve all my problems. And I was not convinced of that either. I did not feel that becoming a woman would solve. I said that to the therapist. Well, it will probably solve some issues and it will create some new ones. And he asked me, yeah, what new ones? I couldn't say much, but I could say one thing is I would be lesbian. That's one thing I realized. I was convinced at that time already that, yeah, that would not change my romantic attraction to women. And that was still unusual at the time, the idea that someone could transition and then be gay afterwards. I think that was not an accepted idea. It's actually, I just recently heard that it's German law is still struggling with that a bit. We had a transsexual law for a long time now, for 40 years already in Germany, but it was all based on very strongly on heteronormative ideas. Well, it didn't go as badly as I expected with romance. I did find a girlfriend when I was 21. There was also always my process that I become friends first and then it developed into something more. So I was also telling her about my feelings. So in the way that I could express it at the time, I said, sometimes I feel I should have been a girl. That was the way I could express that. I was not fully invested in the idea of being a woman, but something is different. Yeah, and there was a few good friends I had, 2 or 3 other good friends that I could talk to about this. So that was a good thing, I think, besides therapy. Also with I had 2 important partners in my life, and I told them both, and they didn't seem to take it too seriously, I have to say. They probably thought that is something mostly in my past. Well, these good friends that I could talk to about it were always women, but that's not that unusual too, because in our society, it's difficult between 2 men to speak about feelings. So most men actually do speak about feelings with women. So that wasn't a big sign also for anything for me. Although I did notice that I have difficulties making friends with women, because when a certain level of closeness, intimacy is reached, they were often retreating. And I remember going around at some point, I asked a few of them, few friends that were not that close yet, and but I could be, maybe. And I asked them beforehand, do you think that men and women can be friends? And well, the conclusion from my conversations I had about it is that, well, if you don't believe in the idea, then you can't. I think it's mostly a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I'm going to break in here briefly to remind you that there are 3 main ways that you can support Graying Rainbows. You can share the show with others, either privately or via social media. Word of mouth will help us reach more people. You can support Graying Rainbows financially at patreon.com/Graying Rainbows, where you can choose a monthly pledge that fits your budget. Last but not least, you can share your story with others via email or by coming on the show or privately in our MeWe group. Just email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. When did you move to Canada? You're in Canada now, right?
That's right, yes. But that's much later, and I think we will come to that, yes. Actually, we're just coming to the question of Japan. I already noticed and I mentioned Japan. So my first girlfriend was Japanese, and that's how Japan came to play a role in my life. It was probably not entirely by chance that I had a foreigner as a girlfriend, because I was probably always drawn to outsiders. Actually, the place where I met her was a group where foreign students could meet German students and practice their German and learn about culture and so on. One thing I noticed also about both of my partners is that both of the serious partners I had in my life, they both were women who actually were rebelling against gendered expectations towards women in their society. So that first girlfriend of mine, she's still in Germany. I think she could not go back to Japan because it was just too narrow a concept of what a woman could do over there. And also something that is true of both of them is that they had a certain degree of bad experience with men. So I guess they were more comfortable with me as a less aggressive, less obviously masculine version of that. So I think these are things that brought the specific couples together. Yeah. So I had a Japanese girlfriend that made me learn Japanese, and eventually I decided to go to Japan. I was not together with her anymore at the time, but Japan was still very interesting and was already a part of my life that I had to invest a lot of time into. And yeah, it was a very good experience and something I was passionate about. Maybe the first thing I was passionate about, because I was drifting for a long time in my 20s and not quite knowing where to go with my life. And it's actually a very recent idea that I had just these days, really, that, maybe the reason that I didn't have good examples of non-binary people out there, or people that I felt very much like me as an example, could have played into that. It was more difficult for me to envision my future because most of the examples we give are specifically masculine or feminine anyway. But I found something that I was passionate about. I wanted to go to Japan. I was not even clear exactly what I wanted to do there. I just took the chance that I saw I had was okay. Also, I had an exchange student program for a year and a half, including some Japanese language. But then I actually got the chance over there to join a PhD program. It was offered to me, and I did that, and I ended up doing my whole PhD in Japan.
In what area?
The area is computational linguistics. That is processing of language by computer. That is written language, not spoken language. So, for example, machine translation. Actually, that's what I was working on at the time, is the computer translating from Japanese to German. Yeah, it was an interesting experience. I really enjoyed, for sure, the first years in Japan. And one thing that I heard from a lot of other people also is that, yeah, I had been feeling different and an outsider all my life. So being in Japan, that was not a problem anymore because, yeah, obviously I am. You just have to look at me. You already know that I'm an outsider. So that's normal. It's not something to worry about why. Another thing is also that the expectations of masculinity are a bit less different. And yeah, you're not supposed to be very aggressive, at least if you're an educated person. Actually, the students that you meet at university and in their early 20s, they tend to be rather shy. And so I wouldn't have stood out there. Actually, me being 10 years older by the time, I was actually not shy at all in comparison. So that was a bit easier. Also, the women are, I know by now, I've known a lot of Japanese people, and I know that it's just outside. It's something you do, not necessarily something you are, but the exterior is usually extremely feminine, even by our standards. Also, that works. It's recognizable as they tend to be cute and shy and giggly and stuff like that. So there was never a worry for me that I would be the more feminine partner if I found a girlfriend here. No. With even now, I don't mind about that, but at the time, it was still something that was not allowed, I guess, in my mind, or something that would make me, not eligible. Yeah, eventually, I found another girlfriend in Japan. And it was again an outsider and was again a foreigner, not a Japanese woman, actually. It was a woman from Vietnam. And we ended up marrying and having a child. Yeah, at that point, when I finished my PhD, I had enough from the Japan experience for a while because, I did not enjoy being an outsider so much anymore. Because I realized, I can be here as long as I want. I speak Japanese fairly well, and it doesn't matter what level of Japanese language or cultural knowledge I have. I will always be treated as different and not be let into the inner circle. And the only Japanese friends I had, they were all outsiders themselves and people who were interested in other cultures and so on. So very ordinary, middle of the road Japanese people, they don't usually open up so much. So I decided to go back to Germany and found a job there. But then there was a .com crash. It was just a bad time in 2001. I lost my job, and then there was nothing to be found anymore for a while. I looked around in other European countries and had some interviews, but it didn't look good. So I said, okay, maybe I need to look outside of Europe too. And I found this job in Canada that looked very well suited to my qualifications and had only 1 hour interview on the phone and got the job. And it was so smooth and fast. And so I moved here. It was only for a year at the beginning. I didn't know how it would work out. And in fact, my contract, it was a university, it was a postdoc position. It was not renewed after a year. My research didn't go too well. But then within 6 weeks, I believe, I found another job at a company here. So I decided, well, it seems to be easier here for me. And I got stuck, I guess.
What part of Canada do you live in?
It is Montreal where I live. So it's predominantly French speaking, which is a little more difficult. I did not learn French much before. And even to this day, I live my life mostly in English, which makes me a bit of a minority. But in Montreal, the city, there's a lot of minorities, and a lot of people, everyone knows English to varying degrees. But yeah, by that time we already had a child, so there was a lot. Yeah, we just 1 year after moving from Japan to Germany, I moved from Germany to Canada, another transcontinental move, and by that time we had a child, this little child, and then I had to find jobs, and there was a lot of things going on. So when I was hit 40, I did not go to therapy. I was not on schedule. I was a bit worried when I came to know that it's a boy by the anatomy, because I felt, how can I teach a boy to be a boy? Because I don't know that myself, how to do that. But these worries turned out to be pretty unfounded. I did pretty much the same thing that I said earlier about my mom. I just treated him as an individual, and as long as it's a small child, it really doesn't make a difference. And as he got older, I told him, don't let anyone tell you can't do anything because you're a boy. Even to boys, I think we need to say that, because actually, I feel that feminism has made some strides. It's not enough, but I think it's the men who are falling behind at this point. I was a feminist from an early age. I followed partly my mother there also, I think, but I was always on board with that. And I also always felt, okay, if women can have all choices, but that should also mean that men could have all choices. And that could mean that men could also be nurturing and be a parent first before being a worker and stuff like that. But I think we're not quite there yet. And maybe I feel sometimes that is one of the reasons that at some point I decided to get just rid of that label of man. I just can't deal with it anymore. I did go into therapy again when I approached 50, and several reasons for that. Of course, my marriage wasn't going well. That's also a reason. But I was also thinking about gender again and other things. And I think it was actually that I was reading up on the internet. By that time, of course, when I was young, there was no internet and there was a lot of information I could not get. But now we are in a time where the internet is very normal, in the mid 2000s. And 2010s already. So I think I was reading up on asexuality. That was a new concept to me also at the time. And that's, I think, where I encountered the term non-binary for the first time also. And read about that and said, wow, this looks like what I've been looking for my whole life. Now, that makes my story really different, because now I'm about almost 50 years old, and I had not identified as queer before. That is the thing that's different to many people's stories. It often starts with being gay, and then at some point you realize, actually I'm trans, and then people transition, and maybe they're even heterosexual after that, or maybe they or not. But they often have a long history of identifying as queer before, and I had not. And so I still feel that makes it more difficult for me to see myself as part of the community. So when I was reading up, of course, I'm a reader. So as soon as I got this idea that I have this new identity, and I had to read everything I could find about it. And I very much embraced this idea of queer, that the original idea of queer from the 1990s, which was very political, which was to say, we refuse the norms, reject the norms. It was very attractive to me. I also read Judith Butler, and it's a really difficult book to read, Tender Trouble by Judith Butler, but I still found there's some sentences in there that really hit me and hit the nail on the head, I think. Within non-binary, there are more specific identities, and I also vibe with other words like genderqueer and also agender, which is to say I don't feel any kind of gender inside. I mentioned earlier, it's not something I feel inside. For me, gender is mostly something that society puts on me. And also, I did not strongly feel body dysphoria, which is often seen as a sign of being trans, is that you're uncomfortable with the body you're in. I had that a bit, but I think it was mainly just my ideas, societal ideas about male sexuality that I was wrestling with, not really my own body. So I used to say also, I don't hate my body. I just hate what society projects onto it. And I think that's a feeling that most women will understand, but maybe men not as much yet.
So, Quinn, since you have discovered this non binary identity, what's the biggest change that's meant for you? Or has it changed your life?
Carrying this identity for me makes me feel much more at liberty of not conforming to any expectations. Because there aren't even specific expectations to non-binary people, even regarding style or clothing or so. Yes. So I play around and I do use like feminine styling sometimes, but for me, it's not so much an expression of myself. It's more signaling to the world, something is going on here. Yeah, don't take me as just one thing or the other. That's what I aspire to. Yeah, as I said, I think gender for me is mostly a set of expectations and the way to interact. We have rules to how to interact with men and how to interact with women differently. And I did not feel I fit into that. So that's what it's about for me. It's mostly social. So I had what's called social dysphoria because I wasn't treated according to what I would like to be treated as. And another thing that it opened up to me though is that my relationship with women have become easier. And I even have participated in some groups that are labeled women's groups. And I usually ask before, because it varies whether they would welcome non-binary people, and sometimes they welcome even trans men, but it varies. So I always ask before, but I was usually accepted. And here in Montreal, it's rather open and welcoming in this respect. It's one of the first really queer groups I went to is called the Lesbian Meetup. And I was really worried before going there the first time, but they were very welcoming. And several people, and it was in a bar, and several people talked to me and say, "Oh, yeah, are you new?" And it was really a good experience. So, and I think that's a very important and good change for me, that I feel much more relaxed interacting with women, because I really hated that being seen as a threat, even if that's even in the background. Like walking on the street at night and the woman walks faster or changes the side of the street or something, it made me feel very uncomfortable when that happened. Yeah, I feel that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, I never really thought of some of these things that you've brought up. I really appreciate you sharing your story. I bet that it's going to resonate with somebody else and help somebody else. So I really appreciate. Is there something in particular, if you could meet yourself 30 years ago, or even somebody else that's having these struggles but's in a different place, that you would want them to know?
I would say maybe, while it's hard to explain yourself if you have these feelings that you don't fit into a gender, it's hard to explain yourself, but it's not as hard just being that. Gender is one of the first things that most people notice about a person, and it influences how they react, but it also is not the only thing and not always the main thing. And often after a few minutes of conversation is not that important anymore.
How's your relationship with your son? Is he about 20 now? How old is he?
He'll be 19 soon. Yes. We didn't have any really long conversations about gender, specifically about my own gender. We didn't. About gender in general sometimes, but I don't think he has an issue with it. But I'm also not sure that he understands too much. He's not part of a woke crowd or something like that. Yeah.
And of course, this generation is more like, whatever, what are you making such a big deal about it, right? They don't appreciate how much things have changed.
Sometimes when his mother was complaining about some things that I did, then he would say, "It's too late for that. I already had the internet." So I've seen it all. Is a bit the attitude they come to the world. It has positive and negative sides.
Absolutely. Is your mother still alive?
No, she actually died this year, just a few months ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I had one conversation with her where I clearly talked about the gender thing, and And she was surprisingly very open. At 79 years old, I was taken by how positive she was. And first of all, she said, "Yeah, whatever. I always love you, and you're you." And but at the end of the conversation, she even said, "Oh, so maybe I have 1.5 girls now, or daughters now." So that was a big leap for a person that age. I think it was really good.
I bet you're glad you had that conversation while she was alive.
Oh yes, yes.
So you had more you wanted to share with us? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I was saying, so since coming out, I wanted to talk about how has it been since I came out. And yeah, as I already said, I had a bit of difficulty feeling part of the community and finding groups that I fit into. And I tried a few trans support groups, and actually some of them even had a lot of non-binary people. But still, they tended not to last long. And most of the non-binary people are in their early 20s. So it's just not quite the same. That's generally a thing that I have to deal with. That most of, I hardly ever met any in real life over 30. I know some on the internet who are older like me or even older, but it's not that many. And so where do I really fit in? Yeah. And I tried various of these lesbian groups, and they were very welcoming, but still it's not quite the same, I feel. Yeah. One thing I definitely still struggle with is since coming out as queer, I have not really had even one official date.
Well, me either. So join the club.
Yes, I remember you saying that. Yes. So this is the thing. I don't even know where to look for that or who to look for, who would be interested in a non-binary person. I tried online dating apps, but they're not really set up for non-binary either. Either you have to register first as male or female, and then you can change your setting, or at least you have to answer the question: are you looking for men or women? And yeah, it's not really. I tried 2 of those, but never went anywhere. And I asked out a few people in real life, but they all said no in the end. And so I've given up a bit on the idea anyway. As I said, for me, it was always friendship first, and it can develop into something. And so I could use some good friends also. And yeah, the group that currently I'm most comfortable in is actually a book club. That is a queer book club, but not more specific than that. But there's rarely any men showing up. It's very, very much women, which is probably a thing about book clubs in general. But yeah, again, most of them are women around 30 that now I'm connecting with. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that I can connect very well with people older than that. We really have to be picked very well beyond that age. Yeah. I wanted to mention that is maybe a thing that could be challenging to anyone who is coming out late. There was an online community that I have been on and off a member of for 25 years from the 1990s. This still exists. And because it's an old technology, it's Usenet actually. So most of the people on there are older than me. Most of them are over 60. A lot of them are over 70. But because I've been a long-term member there, and at times I've been one of the most active members, sometimes, I felt it worth maybe I should come out there too. But that was very challenging. So these are mostly men and mostly over 60. And I met a lot of resistance there to the idea, challenging the idea of binary gender. One thing I noticed with that age group, with men in that age group, is that they confuse ideas about gender very much with ideas about sexuality. So trans with gay and so on. And also the idea of taking on femininity when you're born male and taking on femininity is something very sexualized. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if they even can think of femininity in general without sexualizing it a lot. So that was hard. Yeah. The only allies I found there are the few young people in their 50s. I also struggled with, I already mentioned that I went to some lesbian meetings, but I struggled at first with, can I even take on that term? Can I see myself as lesbian? Because, I was assigned male. My conclusion was, after long thinking, that it makes sense for me because of the kind of relationship I'd like to have. I've always struggled in my marriage. Also, I struggled really with the heterosexual expectations. I would much rather clean the kitchen than the gutters and things like that. But these expectations, even though my wife was from another culture and she was unconventional in her own culture, so it was not as strict. We had to talk more anyway, but there was still some friction there of the way I am.
Well, Quinn, I am struck by the fact that even though your story is unique and a little different from the other stories that I've had on the show, how much you actually have in common with us all. The same struggles of how do you meet somebody at our age? That's number one, right? And how do you find community? And how do you connect to the community that seems to be dominated by younger people?
That's right.
Yeah. And that's the reason why I tried to start the private group, which is currently having some issues of technology. I may actually get you to see if you want to help me with that. Because, we all are struggling with some of these same issues. So I hope that connecting with me will help you feel less alone. And I know that other people will feel less alone because you've taken this step of sharing your story. So thank you.
I would appreciate that a lot if I can help anyone.
I want to thank Quinn Crum for taking the time to share their story with us. Before we talked, I didn't really appreciate why the term non-binary has become so popular. But Quinn's candid description of their journey gave me a new appreciation of the possible origins of the term and its appeal. As always, I'm struck by the fact that although each of us has a unique journey, there is incredible power in sharing our stories with each other. Quinn's story highlights several of the challenges people face coming out LGBT+ later in life, such as finding community and finding love. I'd love to hear from you. Please send me email at greenrainbows@gmail.com. And don't forget, I'm always looking for those who are willing to share their stories. Again, just email me. You can find more episodes of Green Rainbows at greenrainbows.com and subscribe or follow for free in your favorite podcasting app. To get show notes automatically, sign up for our free newsletter. There's a link in the show notes, or you can text Green Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. Spell graying with an A. That's Green Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. Also, I'm thinking about compiling a book of people's stories, since we've all had the experience of looking in vain for books that reflect the experience of coming out LGBT+ later in life. The core of the book is likely to be stories from the podcast, but if you're interested in sharing your story without coming on the show, you can still contact me at greenrainbows@gmail.com. The project is still in its early planning stage, so don't hesitate to reach out to me no matter when you hear this episode. Just a word about our private group on MeWe. We moved from Facebook for better privacy for those who need it. You need an invitation to join, so just email me at greenrainbows@gmail.com if you're interested. If you're already a member of the group on MeWe, don't forget to post and interact with those that are coming on who are new. Finally, I want to thank those of you who are supporting Green Rainbows via Patreon at patreon.com/Green Rainbows. Another way you can support my work is by buying my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, from your favorite online bookstore or my website at brainsciencepodcast.com. I'll be back next month with another interview. Until then, please do check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again next month. Graying Rainbows is copyright 2021 to Dr. Virginia Campbell. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.